Good evening. Tony, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us. Tony is not only the most elegant man of Africa. I'm not kidding. He's always super chic. I'm always jealous about how chic he always is. He's a friend for I don't know how many years. And I know how modest you are, but I need to share with our friends all the things you do. So Tony is, of course, an African leading investor, but also an amazing philanthropist. And he is probably one of the first who started philanthropy in Africa. He's the founder and chairman of Harris Holdings, his family-owned investment company committed to improving lives and transforming Africa through long-term investment in financial services, hospitality, power, energy, technology, and healthcare. And it's one of the reasons why President Obama picked him to join his economic council. So I told you he's a great guy. Tony is also the founder of the Tony Elumelu Foundation, where he works to empower new generation of African entrepreneurs and also driving poverty eradication, driving job creation across all the 54 African countries. But more important, and this is the main topic of our conversation today, because you will discover a new concept, Tony's business and the foundation are inspired by his economic philosophy. So he has a philosophy which we call Africacapitalism. Africacapitalism, which positions the private sector, and more importantly, entrepreneurs, as a catalyst for the social and economic development. And in 2020, the year of COVID, Tony, because he did a lot during the COVID to support the country and support the continent, Tony was named in the Time 100 most influential people in the world, and recognized with Belgium's oldest and highest royal order, Tony Elumelu.
Thank you.
So Tony, tell us more about this philosophy of Africacapitalism and with its focus on entrepreneurship and I would say a new era of inclusive and sustainable prosperity across Africa, please.
Richard, thanks so much for this opportunity, and thanks for all you do in making the world a better place for all of us. Thank you. Africacapitalism stems from my experience. I'm African, born in Africa, bred in Africa, and I've done business in Africa. And I've come to see firsthand the level of poverty on the continent. I've come to see the energy, the youth, the aspirations of our young ones. It's a continent of about 1.4 billion people, and the average age is about 20 years old. So you can imagine the type of continent we have. Yet, joblessness remains an issue. Lack of access to economic opportunities, lack of access to health care. And so all of this, and see in my own life story, how I got to where I am today. In Africa, I realized that the private sector, we do have a role to play in developing the continent. And not just one person, and not just government alone. We don't have, or should not have, any entitlement mentality that some people will come to develop the continent for us. So we decided to involve the young Africans, get the private sector in Africa to work together to prioritize our young ones, get government to create an enabling environment, and hence the philosophy of Africa. And that in the 21st century, first, no one but us can develop Africa. Two, we need all hands on deck in developing Africa. Three, we need to prioritize the young ones to whom the future of Africa belongs to. And most importantly, as private sector people, a realization that it's not about the money we have in our bank accounts, but how we're able to deploy the capital we have in creating economic opportunity and prosperity for our young ones. And so Africacapitalism is a call on the private sector, invest long-term in critical sectors of the African economy that have the potential for transforming and catalyzing economic empowerment and prosperity on the continent, so that at the end of the day, we all go far and go together, and no one left behind. And embedded in it is philosophy of inclusive growth, philosophy of empowering young men, as well as our women who had for a long time been left behind. and realizing that our government must play their own role in catalyzing the opportunities and the enablement that will enable private sector take off, and working also with the philanthropic organization in Africa and outside of Africa to develop the continent.
But how can we combine profitability? Because at the end of the day, in capitalism, it's about profit to reinvest. But how can you combine profitability with all these challenges of creating inclusive model, gender equality, climate resilience, now climate change, especially in Africa, where we are in full transformation and full growth, I would say. So how do you combine, what is the business model to be able to achieve this mission?
So I think one of the reasons Africacapitalism has been accepted and being practiced by quite a number of people is because we don't just preach, we don't just theorize, we practice. So in our group, we have Transcorp, which is the largest electricity generating company in Nigeria today. Transcorp has combined energy generating capacity of 2,000 megawatts. So for an ordinary eye, that is an economic investment that yields profit for the investors. Fine, I will support that. But more importantly, we all know that access to electricity is the single most critical factor that we need to fix if we must develop Africa. For our young ones to go to school, they must have access to electricity. For hospitals to function very well, we must have access to electricity. For businesses to grow, develop, we must have access to electricity. So that is Africacapitalism in action. We're investing, you make profit, but at the same time, simultaneously, not one waiting for the other, you also invest in critical sectors, not just trading, critical sectors that help to move the needles. We need massive investment in electricity on the continent. So an investment in electricity, not just for profitability, it is for profitability because we need sustainability, but more importantly, it helps to fix the challenges that we have, the challenges that hold us from taking off as a continent. So that is the philosophy of Africacapitalism.
And how Africa integration and regional integration is important for this process? Because, as you said, we need electricity everywhere. So a single country is quite a challenge to sometimes invest on power. So which role could play regional integration? Because we are in the region here, the GCC, as we say, and you know very well this part of the world. How can we collaborate? What should we do to have a successful regional integration?
We need to break down the barriers in Africa. We need to wire our infrastructure in a way that encourages intra-Africa trade. We need to produce what our people need. We need to create a bigger market for every one of us. And that is why we support this new movement, the AFCTA, that brings Africa, creates the largest in terms of geography, a market in the world. But more importantly, we need to empower the young generation of Africans to be able to create. Because if you trade and you don't produce what your neighbor needs, your neighbor will go outside to look for who can produce it. So we need to make sure that in Africa we're able to produce what we need. And again, that speaks again to the philosophy of Africacapitalism. We must realize that no one owes us our development. We as Africans must work hard to develop our continent. We must show that in the 21st century we have Africans who are not just agents, commission agents, but who are investors on their continent. If we don't show interest or confidence in our continent, who else will show interest in our continent? So that is what we preach in Africacapitalism. But equally important is a realization that what we seek today as demographic dividend, that is the population. Our population were huge in terms of number, and more importantly, the demography is very, very favorable. Young people, that is huge market for the world. That is huge labor for the world. But we need to catalyze this and shape it in a way that is progressive, in a way that is positive, and not in a way that people become disenchanted with life and now begin to embrace migration or extremism. And that, again, is another call I always make to African leaders, friends of Africa. And I'm happy I'm in the Middle East, I'm in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's an opportunity to take the message to the world. Africa is ready for investments. Africa has a lot of opportunities. We do have challenges, but in spite of the challenges, the opportunities are huge, and people should take advantage of the opportunity. We need a Marshall Plan for Africa. We need to mobilize huge capital, long-term capital into the continent to enable us leapfrog and enable us fix infrastructure that we need to develop. Japan, Germany, Korea, even China have benefited from massive global capital infusion. Africa needs this, and I'll be failing if I don't use this opportunity to draw the attention of the world to the opportunity we have on the continent, and they need to come to invest in Africa. They need to collaborate with African business leaders, and more importantly, those like the Elumelu Foundation who like to support young African entrepreneurs. Let's see how we can work together to create a better future for everyone.
Tony, let's insist on this point. Yesterday, in my opening remarks, I said something which I'm a true believer, which is, by the way, was inspired to me by President Clinton. I have to confess, when President Clinton first inauguration, he said, there is nothing bad in the United States which could not be corrected by what is good in the United States. So I paraphrased President Clinton yesterday by saying something which I'm convinced there is nothing bad in our humanity which could not be stopped by what is good in our humanity. So let's ask you about Africa. What is good in Africa today? Because, we need to be very frank here. Many people have a specific perception about Africa, especially in this part of the world. I have a long conversation with many friends who say, going to Africa is not always stable, it's complicated. If you don't visit, it's like the perception that many people had a very wrong perception years ago about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, when you don't travel a lot, you are always influenced by media, etc. So what is good in Africa which we should build on to definitely eradicate or minimize what is not doing well?
No, first is I'd like to share with our great audience here that Africa is a continent of 54 countries. It's not one country. Two is that Africa is a continent of 1.4 billion people and growing. So the characterization at times, if in a country of 1.4 billion people, you have 1,000 bad people, that does not make the continent a bad continent. Just like other parts of the world, we have our challenges as well. Growing up, reading the Guinness Book of Records, it was stated then that crime occurs every 4 seconds in New York. Every 4 seconds in New York, someone is attacked. Okay, then that did not stop, and today does not stop people from wanting to go to New York or go to America. So at times, when we see or read out some of these things, we tend to over-dramatize about the negative things. Now, what is good about Africa? A lot. But to me, the most potent resource on the continent is our demography. Populous, young, energetic, intelligent, ambitious. It's a huge workforce for the world. And that is why I say, when I comment on digital divide, I say that digital divide must not lead to a societal divide. We need to develop everyone. Today in Africa, Nigeria in particular, we have massive immigration of people to Canada, to the UK. They support hospitals. They support IT sector in these countries. How about investing further collectively so that we can develop this workforce, so that this workforce becomes a positive force for the world and not a negative breathing space or ground for extremism. Another thing we have on the continent is huge natural resource endowment. Unfortunately, because of gaps and inefficiency and at times poor leadership, we export this as raw materials, and these raw materials are processed. Value addition does not occur on the continent where the raw material exists, and they come back by way of finished products. So again, it's an opportunity for investors to come into. So if you look at this, and in terms of Africa can feed the world in terms of food security, arable land on the continent. So there's quite a lot of good things. But having said that, there are a few bad things, but it's happened everywhere in the world, but it's totally statistically insignificant. Totally insignificant. And the message should be that we should realize that Africa is a continent of 54 countries, 1.4 billion people, a lot of young people, and it's not just one country. So that broad characterization of Africa is like this is totally different.
Tony, last question, very short answer. I never asked you for years and years that question, and today I want to ask you, who was or who is your role model?
I have two. Unfortunately, they are both dead, but I like Steve Jobs for all the things he did. A man who founded a company in his death, years after his death, became the first company to cross $1 trillion in market capitalization. That's great, a man of great foresight. I like him. And second one, interestingly, is Michael Jackson. Why do I like Michael Jackson? He epitomized hard work, excellence. People often say, or you go watch Michael Jackson, you say, what a star. Wow, he's so talented, blessed. He worked hard for it. If you watch This Is It, if you watch some of his videos, you see the practice, the hard work, the excellence that goes into it. Then you begin to realize that this is not a fluke. It's not just a fluke. It's not just luck. He worked hard for it. And this is what I preach to my children. This is what I tell my children, my colleagues, about life. You need to work hard, put in the time, the hours, and you see the outcome. So these two men, man of foresight, Steve Jobs, Michael Jackson, a man of excellence.
Tony Elumelu, thank you. And a round of applause for great entrepreneur.